Mr. Chairman, while tens of thousands of Californians are still reeling from the fires that forced them to evacuate and that destroyed their homes and their livelihoods, Republicans are exploiting this crisis with a hearing that does nothing more than provide a sad excuse to further their long-held goal of dismantling the regulations that keep us safe. Rather than face the undeniable facts of climate change and the need for urgent, unfettered federal assistance to help Californians rebuild their lives, Republicans want to change the subject. But we should begin by remembering the tens of thousands of people whose lives have been upended by this disaster.
If you look back in the history of California, for me, this is comparable to the 1906 earthquake in California. And the level of catastrophe and disaster here is high. And there's one reason that we're seeing a fire this ferocious. It's the weather, and the number one piece in the weather is the wind.
Anthony Maroney is chief of the LA County Fire Department, one of the officials overseeing the firefight. He told us the devil winds hurled embers far ahead of the fire, like snowfall from hell.
Made louder. The devastation wrought by these fires is unimaginable, and the only question we should be asking now is how we can help the people of California recover. And despite the heroism of first responders and plentiful water access, all but one small reservoir closed for maintenance, the fires tragically destroyed acres upon acres of homes and communities. Instead of responding to this tragedy with open hearts, Republicans, led by President Trump and his unelected co-president Elon Musk, have resorted to a flurry of baseless accusations and scurrilous misinformation seeking to blame California's Democratic elected officials. And when they claim to be helping the situation, they've actually done more harm than good. For example, President Trump has falsely argued that environmental protection policies left Southern California without sufficient water to fight the wildfires, despite clear evidence to the contrary. Nevertheless, he ordered the release of over 2 billion gallons of water in the Central Valley, purportedly to support his unsubstantiated claims. The president claimed that the water was, quote, heading to farmers throughout the state and to Los Angeles. This critical agricultural resource, desperately needed by California's farmers for the spring, was instead, due to the president's actions, diverted into the Pacific Ocean, 100 miles away from Los Angeles. California does not need political photo ops that waste desperately needed water. They need real federal assistance. And how does the president respond? By insisting that any federal aid come with strings attached that further his own political agenda, like voter ID laws. Never mind that California already has voter ID laws, but the president wants to play politics rather than help those in need.
And Gavin Newsom is going to sign those papers. And if he doesn't sign those papers, we won't give him money to put out all his fires. And if we don't give him the money to put out his fires, he's got problems. He's a lousy governor. So I said, Gavin, will you sign? It took him like a month and a half or 2 months, and then he decided for political reasons. And then we got hit with COVID, and we had to solve another problem.
That is outrageous. And it is outrageous that Republicans in Congress, including Speaker Johnson, have indicated that they are open to placing conditions on disaster aid, especially ones that have nothing to do with wildfires. Not only is that wrong for California, but it is simply wrong to treat the citizens of any state as pawns in a political game. Natural disasters tragically affect millions of Americans across the country each year. As FEMA's website explains, its purpose is, quote, to help people before, during, and after disasters, unquote. To help people, all people. It is not there to help just the Republicans or just the Democrats or to promote partisan objectives. It has always been and should always remain strictly neutral in its work. Members should be careful before they consider attaching political strings to the federal funds needed to recover from natural disasters. If it can happen to California, it can happen to your state too. In 2024 alone, the states my colleagues across the aisle represent collectively had 122 extreme weather events that necessitated FEMA assistance. 122 extreme weather events made worse and made more frequent by the realities of climate change that the majority still will not acknowledge. Imagine if then President Biden had conditioned necessary FEMA disaster recovery funds on strings that bear no relation to the disasters their constituents are still recovering from. They would have been outraged, justifiably. But today, they remain silent. And today, instead of letting California recover from the blazes that were contained only 5 days ago, and to take stock of how to rebuild, the majority is leveraging the pain and suffering of Americans to push a message of deregulation over all else. Instead of supporting our fellow Americans as they pick up the pieces, instead of ensuring that our neighbors have the resources they need to recover from this disaster, instead of working to slow the devastating effects of climate change that affect us all, Republicans will return to their tired old playbook and blame everything on overregulation. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by Frank Freevault, a retired fire chief with actual experience on the ground fighting fires and saving lives. I'm looking forward to hearing from a true expert on how we can best help California in its hour of need.
Natalie, for using your time. Thank you, Chairman Fitzgerald, for letting me attend. Mr. Hilton, are you a firefighter?
I'm not a firefighter.
Mr. Ring, are you a firefighter? Mr. Ring, it's just a yes or no question. Mr. Ring, are you a firefighter? No. All right, Mr. Green, are you a firefighter?
I'm not a firefighter.
The northern part of my district was evacuated. I've talked to numerous firefighters. I've visited the intensive damage. I've had multiple briefings from firefighters, first responders, and fire chiefs. This is what they told me. The reason these fires in Southern California spread so quickly, caused so much damage, was because of Santa Ana winds that reached unprecedented gusts of 100 miles per hour. Gusts so high that helicopters and the airplanes could not fly. Also because of very low relative humidity and the driest conditions in California history. None of the firefighters said it was about overregulation or homeless people or the Delta spelt fish or the timber harvest or voter ID laws. So shame on anyone who is exploiting the pain and suffering of disaster victims to jam through partisan ideological policies. We should get disaster aid to these disaster victims now without conditions, just like we treat every other disaster victim across America. We just gave aid this past December to South Carolina, Florida, Oklahoma. The Democrats say, hey, we want you to do better on climate change policies in your state. No, we just gave that aid because these are Americans who are suffering. So do not exploit them. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ranking member has a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since the majority is having this hearing on California fires without the participation of members who represent the Palisades and Eaton, I seek unanimous consent to enter statements from Representatives Chu and Sherman into the record.
Without objection, Mr. Hilton, you may begin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and all your colleagues for giving me the opportunity to be here today. My comments reflect both the policy work that I've done that Mr. Kiley mentioned at my organization Golden Together, specifically 2 reports which I'd like to draw your attention to, reducing California's carbon emissions through modern forest management, and secondly, water abundance. But my comments also reflect more recent conversations with firefighters in Los Angeles, retired firefighters across the state, and the victims of this disaster. And I have to say to the ranking member, those victims will be offended by the remarks we just heard, which were frankly outrageous and offensive, preposterously claiming that the regulations keep us safe. It is the regulations that put Californians in danger, as we have all been highlighting. It's described sometimes, this disaster, as a natural disaster. It is not a natural disaster. This was a man-made disaster. More precisely, a Democrat-made disaster. That is not hyperbole. That is the only plausible explanation for the impact here. We are still waiting, of course, to understand the ignition, what precisely ignited these fires. But the impact, there's no question that it was the direct result of Democrat policy and Democrat appointments to the bureaucracies who implemented those policies. As we've been hearing, fire is a natural part of life in these areas that burned. That is not new. We have had fires for decades. We have had fire prevention for decades. But in the last 2 decades, that kind of sensible fire prevention was blocked by Democrat policy. We have heard a lot as we've watched these disasters unfold, about containment. What does containment mean? It doesn't mean putting out the fires. It means clearing the perimeter, fuel management, fire prevention. That is what's actually happening. Bulldozers and firefighters with axes. There's a simple question. We can do that before these fire disasters, or we can do it after. The choice that Democrats have made is to force it to be done by our brave firefighters after the event instead of preventively beforehand. Let's be specific. There was an article in the New York Times about Philip and Claire Vogt, who designed and built one of the most fire-resistant homes in America on a peak in the Santa Monica Mountains. Quote, "For months, Philip had been volunteering to clear away the dead undergrowth on the parkland surrounding his property, but California officials told him he could be fined for meddling with a sensitive habitat." Who are these California officials? Number one, CARB, the California Air Resources Board. In 2000, they issued new smoke management regulations that effectively prohibited the kind of controlled burns that were the norm for decades before. As we were hearing, the California Coastal Commission prohibiting sensible fire prevention measures to save a Bronton's milkvetch shrub, which they claim is endangered. And worst of all, as we were hearing, the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, every single firefighter that I spoke to in Los Angeles said, what are these people doing, stopping us from taking the sensible steps to keep our communities safe? This is the direct result of overregulation. And I could go on. In 2020, State Senate bill in the California legislature, SB 182, would have mandated fire prevention and resilience, including evacuation routes, vegetation management, fire-safe construction. It was vetoed by Governor Newsom. Here is a quote from his veto letter. "It fails to account for the consequences that could increase sprawl." So yet again, you have sensible fire prevention blocked by overregulation because of ideology about the war on single-family homes that's being waged in California. On and on, every single aspect of this disaster, the failures that led up to it, the failures of response, all of it the result of Democrat policy. Who else is there to blame? Who else has been in charge in Los Angeles and across the state of California in these years? So now we have some demands. We have demands from the people affected who never want to see this happen again. Number one, any support from Congress for what's happened must include a requirement for their sensible reforms, the common sense measures that we have outlined here and is in the policy reports that we put before you. Safeguards to make sure this money, the federal money, is spent properly, any money. Just as we saw with the 9/11 victim compensation, we need a special master appointed to make sure that money is not wasted. And finally, there is a bill on the desk of Governor Newsom right now for Trump-proofing California, even as he goes to the office and begs for help for his state. Surely a condition of any support must be for Governor Newsom to veto that bill.
Full committee, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I appreciate the remark of the gentleman from North Carolina that we should not be here to engage in political rhetoric and exploitation of these terrible events. States, counties, localities all over America are affected by weather calamities that are coming on with extraordinary velocity because of climate change. I want to yield to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, several minutes in order to pursue his line of questions.
Thank you, Ranking Member Raskin. So the majority's witnesses, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Ring, and Mr. Greenhut, are not firefighters. Well, thank goodness we do have a firefighter on this panel today, Mr. Freevold, who not only was a firefighter, he was a fire chief. And he, in his testimony, talks about that this is not a traditional wildfire. This is a wildland-urban conflagration. And I'm going to show you in a little bit a video of what was happening. But I just want to explain, when you solve for the wrong problem, not only do you not get the solution, you can cause harm. So Donald Trump has it in his mind that somehow there's a spigot in Northern California, he's going to open a valve and dump water to Southern California. Here are the facts. Southern California's reservoirs are at near record levels when this fire happened. Didn't matter because Donald Trump then ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to release over 2 billion gallons of water that almost flooded farmland, if not for the local water districts that pushed back. But guess what? This water was saved for the farmers for the summer season when they needed the water. And so the president wasted all this water that isn't even reaching Southern California. It's going to evaporate for a PR stunt. So this was a harmful, ludicrous action to solve for the wrong problem. And so I want to show a video now of what was happening in the Eaton fire that wiped out Altadena. Just watch this 15-second video. That is not a timber harvest problem, not a desalinization problem, not a homeless person problem, not a voter ID problem. That is burning embers being blown by unprecedented Santa Ana winds that reach up to 100 miles per hour. And these burning embers that could be softball size would fly for miles and miles and miles and hit a structure and set that structure on fire. And then that structure became the fuel for the fire. That's what was happening. The structures became the fuel for the fire. And so, Mr. Freeval, can you talk about, first of all, confirm that that is true, and then explain in your testimony about strengthening sort of these structures with fire-resistant materials?
Concur with what you said initially. Repeat the last part of your question, please.
In your testimony, you talk about how to harden some of these
Yes.
structures with fire-resistant materials, which actually is something that might make sense, not for the other random policies that the majority of witnesses are trying to jam through on ideological reasons.
I would point to two standing sets of work that we could start on yesterday. The first is the Wildfire Prepared Home designation from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. That's a package of mitigations that has been proven to be effective on really two things. It is preventative embers getting into structures and then starting the structure itself on fire. And it also helps with low duration, low intensity fire in and around the structure. While those are necessary, they're insufficient when we get high concentrations of structure. We need to get enough of those parcel level mitigations done to protect structure to structure spread. If you just do one here, one there, you'll still lose that piece. The second one comes out of the National Institute for Standards Technology, Technical Note 2205, Hazard Mitigation Methodology, excellent set of recommendations.
Thank you. And let me just say this. It is particularly outrageous for witnesses to somehow blame Democrats. You know who signed CEQA? Ronald Reagan. That's who signed CEQA. And Governor Newsom pre-positioned assets before this fire. But those helicopters and airplanes could not fly over the Eaton fire because of the 100-mile-per-hour winds. That was the truth. That is what happened. Go do your own research. I yield back.
And I'll yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman from
It's the next big scandal waiting to happen. It's an issue that frankly crosses party lines and has tainted our politics for too long. It's an issue that exposes the far too cozy relationship between politics, government, business, and money. I'm talking about lobbying, and we all know how it works. The lunches, the flights, the hospitality, the quiet word in your ear, the ex-ministers and ex-advisors for hire, helping big business find the right way to get its way. Mr. Cameron, do you remember those words?
I do. I made them in 2010, and we made two very important changes.
And yes, you've already mentioned those.
No, I haven't.
Do you understand? Yes, you have. Do you understand the irony of having used them, given many of us believe that the quote depicts your own behaviour with Greensill?
Well, let me explain, because I haven't mentioned one of the changes that we made, because it was important, which is when I made those remarks, there'd just been, I think, a lobbying scandal involving a firm that was approached by a journalist pretending to be from the government of Uzbekistan. And the lobbying firm in question said, we can get you into ministers, we can get you to see people, and no one needs to know who you are lobbying on behalf of. And so the change that the Lobbying Act brought in, I know it's criticized now, but the change the Lobbying Act brought in, which was to make sure that multi-client lobbyists had to register who their clients were, that was an important change because it put a stop to that problem. And if you combine it with the issue of having to report the meetings that ministers have, you've got two very valuable tools in making sure that people can see who is lobbying whom and on whose behalf. And as I said, in my interactions from Greensill to the government, I absolutely knew that if the meetings I wanted to take place did take place, they would be properly reported on and everyone would know about them. And that is absolutely right. And of course, before
Cameron, I'm ever so sorry, but this is a meeting to ask you questions rather than to allow you to talk for the next 2 hours. You had the enormous privilege of being the Prime Minister of our great country. You're one of only 5 people post-war to have been re-elected to lead our government. Do you not feel that you have demeaned yourself and your position by WhatsApping your way around Whitehall on the back of a fraudulent enterprise based on selling bonds of high-risk debt to unsuspecting investors?
Well, my view is that what I did was I made a choice to work for a business which I hoped would be a UK fintech success story, and many people believe that it would. And I wanted to help that company grow and expand. And what I did at the time of economic crisis was put to the government what I genuinely believed to be a good idea for how to get money into the hands of small businesses and get their bills paid early. I've said that, looking back and now looking forward, ex-prime ministers are in a very important and different position. And so a single letter or email would be more appropriate. But we were in very different circumstances when COVID happened.
But do you not think that you were presenting a business that had fundamental financial problems and the efforts were in order to fill the holes in that business rather than help the British taxpayer?
My interaction with the government is because I genuinely believed these were good ideas to help small businesses. And if you look at of course, this business went into administration, it failed, and we need to learn the lessons from that. And there are lots of lessons, and I look forward to reading what your committee has to say about it. But what I don't accept is that it was a business that was predetermined to fail. At its heart was a simple and good idea, which is to go to large corporate companies like Airbus with 26,000 suppliers.
You don't believe it was a Ponzi scheme, because that's what Lord Miners told us.
Well, no, if you take the Airbus example, which was a leading client of Greensill, we were paying their 25,000 suppliers instantly, getting cash into tens of thousands of small businesses, and then Airbus would pay back Greensill, and a bond would be floated in the meantime. That idea of using technology and deep capital markets to help small businesses, that is a good idea.
As recently as Tuesday, Mr Greensill, who you seem to be painting as a reincarnation of the late Mother Teresa, told the committee that this was a great business only brought down by unreasonable and greedy insurance companies. We now know that 90% of Greensill's business was lending against transactions that have never happened, may never happen, and with companies that don't even know that they are involved, and then selling it on at low risk. Mr Cameron, do you still believe that that business model was a good one?
What I believe is that the key idea of supply chain finance, of going to big companies and saying, we will pay your suppliers early, get cash into those businesses, that is a good idea. And the companies that Greensill work with, like Vodafone and AstraZeneca and Ford Motor Company and Airbus, big responsible employers, big important companies.
Cameron, do you know what a prospective receivable is?
Well, I've listened very carefully to the evidence you've been hearing over previous days, and the concept of prospective.
That didn't involve any of the companies you just listed.
Well, let's deal with future receivables, which I think is the correct term. And future receivables were involved in the supply chain finance scheme that I helped to set up in government, which was the way that the NHS, under this scheme, pharmacies were paid early. And pharmacies, of course, are very small.
When during the height of the crisis, you were bothering ministers and civil servants, did you know that 90% of Greensil's business represented unsecured loans to high-risk borrowers, and half the time without any invoice whatsoever?
Well, that's not a figure I recognise. I listened to Mr Greensil's evidence to you on Tuesday, where he talked about future receivables being perhaps 20% of the business. And I think when it comes to future receivables, it is important to recognise that in the case of the NHS and the pharmacy scheme,
can I just ask you a question about the NHS? Turning now to Greensil's proposals for our NHS, and that named earned to pay doctors and nurses daily or weekly in advance, do you accept that your lobbying of the NHS wasn't for its health, but for the health of Greensil's balance sheet?
I wouldn't accept that for 1 second, because the whole concept of earned in the NHS was that it was going to be free to not just the employee, but also free to the NHS itself. Why I thought this was so attractive is that, I remember probably answering questions from you about the evils of payday lending, and the idea that staff in the NHS can draw down their salary as they earn it, rather than have to wait till the end of the month. I think that could go some way to ending the use of payday lending. And of course, this is a really important point.
Mr. Cameron, Greensil's own administration documents make clear, and I quote, "The commercial rationale for providing these services without profit was to create critical mass, to enable Earned UK to sell to corporate entities, to generate revenues, and to provide cross-selling opportunities to the wider group." So I ask you again, do you now accept that your lobbying of the NHS was about a commercial incentive for Greensill?
No, I don't accept that, because
it's nothing sacred.
No, from Greensil's point of view, this was part of its corporate social responsibility program, of saying to the NHS, this is going to be free, not just to the doctors and nurses, but free to the NHS trusts as well. And
of course, it left Greensill free to sell to corporate entities, to generate revenues, and to provide cross-selling opportunities to the wider group. Not my words, Greensill's words.
But you asked me about...
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
This is going to be the first government in modern history that at the end of its parliamentary term has less regulation in place than there was at the beginning. We've now identified those 3,000 regulations that we're going to scrap, and we have already got rid of 800 of them.
Setting out some concrete steps that are going to make it easier for businesses to cope with this great big machine of health and safety that's built up over the years. And I don't think there's any one single way you can cut back the health and safety monster. You've got to look at the quantity of rules, and we're cutting them back. You've got to look at the way that they're enforced, and we're making sure that is more reasonable.
This man has done more to divide this nation than anybody else. He's looked after his own pocket. I still refer to him as Dodgy Dave.